Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion. Rock and metal invasion.
Hi, welcome to Rock and Metal Invasion. My name is Steve. Coming up on the show today, I'm going to be talking about a murder I was there for. In fact, I witnessed it. I'm going to be talking about the death of hair metal. I'm going to be talking about what or who killed hair metal. To solve this case, I'm going to look at 8 potential suspects, and I'm going to answer the question: are they responsible for the death of hair metal? Let's look at our first suspect. So a number of people have said that Nirvana killed hair metal. They've said when Smells Like Teen Spirit first hit the airwaves, that was the beginning of the end for hair metal. But it wasn't just the song. The band itself, Nirvana, were the complete opposite to everything that hair metal stood for. They didn't really have an image. Their lyrics were much more open to interpretation. And they certainly didn't sing about having sex with groupies. And their songs, let's be honest, they had more lyrical meaning. It wasn't all about having nothing but a good time. And let's be honest, they were not a fan of hair metal bands. Kurt in particular would say he thought they were a joke. And as Nirvana gained popularity, hair metal's popularity declined. So, Nirvana, are they to blame for the death of hair metal? Well, I actually don't think you can blame one band. Yes, they were definitely highly influential. And yes, perhaps they triggered the death of hair metal and started the popularity of similar bands that were like Nirvana. But Nirvana themselves, I don't think they killed hair metal. So perhaps if it wasn't a band that killed hair metal, maybe it was a genre. So did grunge kill hair metal? Following the success of Nirvana, as what often happens with music, and when a certain type of music gets popular, other bands end up coming out with a similar sound. But grunge was nothing new. It had actually been around for quite some time. Nirvana just made it popular. Also, like a lot of genres, bands that, get put into a genre can have similarities, but can also sound quite different. For example, Pearl Jam are put in the grunge category, but they don't really sound like Nirvana. And the same thing kind of happened with hair metal bands. That bands would be put in the hair metal category, but they might sound quite different from another band in the hair metal category. So did grunge, not just Nirvana, but grunge, kill hair metal? Well, like I said, grunge had already been around for a while. Nevermind wasn't even Nirvana's first album. It was their second album. Now, of course, it was the album that really broke through and became successful. I mean, massively successful. And when that became successful, other similar sounding bands started coming out and getting attention. And of course, the whole Seattle scene was very big at the time as well. So you had bands like Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. They were all getting more airplay, more coverage in magazines. And just like Nirvana, this music they were putting out was so different to hair metal. And lyrically, these bands, they had more meaning and depth. Because let's be honest, hair metal, it had its cliches, but so did grunge. But these cliches were the opposite to hair metal. It was, life sucks, I'm not having a good time, and let's do drugs, just like in hair metal, we do drugs, but it wasn't for a good time. Let's do drugs to numb the pain. So, did grunge kill hair metal? I don't think so. Because I don't see why grunge and hair metal couldn't have just coexisted together. So why didn't they? Well, I think the problem is media didn't let it happen. So did the media kill hair metal? When I talk about the media, I'm talking about MTV, music television, radio, and magazines. Those are the three areas of media which are highly influential on whether you're going to be successful or not. And ironically, MTV had a lot to do with the success of hair metal, just like it had a lot to do with the success of Nirvana and the popularity of grunge. And of course, radio is really important as well because, if your song gets played on the radio, you've got a much better chance of selling albums. And radio play, back in those days was really important. Essentially, radio, MTV, the magazines, they were pretty much like the gatekeepers. They were the ones who would almost really decide what people were going to hear or read about. And of course, they're going to want to play or write about what other people want to hear and read about, because that's going to sell magazines and that's going to be what people will want to listen to or watch. And, the switch from hair metal didn't happen straight away. They didn't suddenly just flick a switch and it's gone. I remember hearing Nirvana for the first time on radio and thinking to myself, whoa, what is this? I loved it. But, I didn't go home and throw away my Motley Crue or Skid Row records. And radio was still playing Motley Crue and Skid Row. But only for a while. Eventually, you start to hear more Pearl Jam, more Nirvana, more Alice in Chains. And slowly the Skid Rows, the Motley Crues, the Poisons, they started getting dropped from the playlist. Meanwhile, bands that would fit the grunge or alternative genre were being added. So, of course, eventually it got really hard for these hair metal bands to get noticed. And if people aren't hearing you or reading about you, you get forgotten. And, you can't blame the record companies because, hey, they're seeing what's happening and they're just responding accordingly. So did the media kill hair metal? Well, the problem with a question like that is it's not specific enough. I mean, media is huge. You can't just blame the media. But it got me thinking, maybe it's a specific type of media. Maybe it was a TV show. A TV show called Beavis and Butthead. So Beavis and Butthead actually debuted on MTV in 1993. And the main characters wore t-shirts that displayed a love for AC/DC and Metallica. And when I first saw them, I thought it was really cool because, there really weren't many characters on TV who displayed a love for hard rock and heavy metal. And that's a genre of music I really like. So I thought it was cool. And also, when they were watching the music videos, it was often my one and only chance to see a specific music video. A lot of the times they'd play music videos I had never seen. And they were influential because, bands like White Zombie had success based on being played on a Beavis and Butthead episode. However, it was not so good for Winger because while Beavis and Butthead were not the cleverest characters, they did seem kind of cool. And compared to another character on the show called Stuart, they were very cool because Stuart was portrayed as dorky and geeky. And what was on his t-shirt? Winger. So if you liked Winger in the Beavis and Butthead world, you were a steward. And let's be honest, no one wants to be a steward. So, with Lars throwing darts at Kip Winger in a Metallica music video and Stewart with his Winger t-shirt, it's really not surprising that Winger were not able to survive, at least for some part of the 90s. I mean, ironically, 1993 had seen Winger release what many people think is their best album, Pull, an album I really love. But unfortunately, thanks to Beavis and Butthead, Winger in 1993 were not a cool band to like. And I know I'm only talking about Winger, but here's the thing. Winger are associated with the hair metal scene. And so, all these other hair metal bands are kind of guilty by association. However, like I said, this Beavis and Butthead, it debuts in 1993. So, to say Beavis and Butthead killed hair metal is a little harsh. But did they put the final nail in the coffin? Maybe, but they're not the murderer. In fact, maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Maybe it's not Beavis and Butthead, and maybe it's not grunge and alternative rock. Maybe it wasn't even a genre. Maybe it wasn't any type of media. Maybe it was hair metal itself. Maybe hair metal killed itself. Maybe it was suicide. So, did hair metal kill itself? There's some good arguments for this. First, the album covers. So, this is the album cover for Silent Rage, Don't Touch Me There. Yeah, maybe the girls liked it. There's the guys on the back. But if you want to be successful in the music business, I think you want to appeal to both genders. Most guys don't want to look at another guy's six-pack on the album cover. Next, Poison. Look what the cat dragged in. Okay, this is better. Some hot woman. Only problem is they're not women. Okay, yeah, we know Poison is actually for guys. But in the 90s, covers like that started to look a little uncool. Then again, in the mid-80s, late 80s, you could expect these kind of covers. So, I don't know, maybe it's not the album covers. Maybe not album covers, but cover songs. And yes, Poison, you are potentially guilty again. Your Mama Don't Dance. I never need to hear that song again. Although I probably shouldn't blame Poison because Y&T covered it first. Great White, Once Bitten, Twice Shy? No thanks. Motley Crue, Smoking in the Boys' Room. Well, here's the thing. Would I prefer to listen to Smoking in the Boys' Room or Louder Than Hell? Enough said. So, the answer is pretty obvious. And as much as I appreciate Slade, Quiet Riot covered them twice. And so did other hair metal bands. So it became a bit of a cliche to cover a 70s rock song, just like the Power Ballad. That was also a hair metal cliche. The band would put out their first song, which might be a rocker, but then that second song, that second single, would be the ballad. Every album had to have at least one ballad. There were a few exceptions, but pretty much every hair metal band that put out an album had at least one ballad on it. And hey, it worked. Well, it worked for at least for a while. But after a while, it became predictable, and people got sick of it. Oh yeah, here's another cover song, just to get a hit. here's another ballad that they're only putting out just to get a hit. And then what about the lyrics? I mean, when you're talking about hair metal, okay, you don't expect lyrical genius, but some of them have not aged very well. Here's an example. This is Roxy Blue from 1992. This isn't even the 80s. This is 1992. The song Rob the Cradle. And here are the lyrics. Let this be our secret, baby. Yeah, that's what I told her. Because I need it now. And I can't wait until you're older. It feels so right, even though it's wrong. Now, I've done shows on album covers, cover songs, and hair metal lyrics before. So I guess it's nothing new. But, you know, those are not good lyrics. Those were not good covers. And some of those cover songs are not great. But maybe that wasn't the problem. Maybe it's just oversaturation. Maybe there were just too many bands, all trying to be, you know, the next Motley Crue, Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, Skid Row, Guns N' Roses. I mean, there were just so many of them. My album collection behind me is evidence of that. You know, and I'm still trying to listen to it all now, even with the internet. There's so much hair metal from the 80s, early 90s to listen to. And yeah, some of it, it's not that great. It's not even worth bothering with. However, there are some great bands. And there's also some not very good ones. At the end of the day, though, I guess you kind of think, well, the cream should always rise to the top. So, you know, okay, some bands aren't gonna make it, but they're the ones that aren't very good. So maybe oversaturation wasn't the problem. What about production? Maybe hair metal was overproduced or was starting to get overproduced. Well, I actually think the production of at least major label hair metal was really good. Yeah, you know, arguably or subjective, but Mutt Lange perhaps overproduced Def Leppard's Hysteria. But I know some people think Hysteria is Def Leppard's best album. Okay, what about outside songwriters? So this is something that some hair metal bands would do. But, you know, I actually think, you know, especially guys like Desmond Child, Jack Ponty, they wrote some great songs. Sure, sometimes some of the songs did start to sound, you know, like other songs you've heard, you know, but they had some hits and they also wrote some great songs. And often they didn't do the whole album, it's just one or two songs. So I don't think that was a problem. And yeah, you could argue, what about the image? You know, too much emphasis on the image, you know, and maybe, you know, some of these hair metal bands, they actually weren't very good musicians. They couldn't really play. But, you know, the reality is most of these guys in the bands were really amazing musicians. So not being able to play, that wasn't the problem. They could play. In fact, you know, arguably, the musicians in hair metal bands were better than many of the grunge alternative rock musicians. So they could back it up. They could back up their image with their playing abilities. So finally, I got to say, no, I don't think hair metal killed itself. So if it's not suicide, who was the murderer? Well, I'm starting to think it's not one particular thing. What I mean by that is, you know, we talked about Nirvana as a suspect. We've talked about grunge as a genre as a suspect. But maybe it's a variety of bands, and maybe it's a variety of hard rock and heavy metal subgenres that killed hair metal. If you go back to 1992, one of the biggest and up-and-coming popular metal bands was Pantera. They had just released Vulgar Display of Power, and it was a game changer. Metallica had released the Black Album in 1991, and that was a massive album that gave them mainstream success. In 1992, Rage Against the Machine released their debut album. And while that wasn't a hit, straight away, over time, it became a highly influential album. Same with Tool. Same with Korn. All bands that rock and metal fans could potentially like, and none of them are grunge. I know for me, when I heard this album, Burn My Eyes from Machine Head in 1994, and of course, the 1994 Pantera album, Far Beyond Driven, I just thought these albums had power and intensity that hair metal wasn't able to match. It didn't mean I didn't like hair metal, but this was music that I think was worth checking out. But again, we're talking 1994, so again, we're talking final nails in the coffin. But, I still think it's important to realize it wasn't just the grunge bands that shifted and changed the musical landscape. But at the same time as well, you really can't blame all of those bands for killing hair metal. Maybe, sure, you could suggest they influenced some of the hair metal bands to change their own sound. And is that what killed hair metal? Hair metal bands not sticking to their sound and trying to stay current. So there are examples of hair metal bands who survived, or at least decided to still exist in the 90s, but tried to create music that was, grunge or alternative or some other subgenre of rock and metal. Dokken did it, Wildside did it, Warrant did it. Arguably, they still had some hair metal influences, but it was definitely different to the music they were putting out in the 80s or early 90s. And while in some cases, it wasn't necessarily bad, doing that wasn't going to help keep hair metal alive. And, by the time bands, the ones that did decide to stick around and start doing this, hair metal was already pretty much dead. So while it didn't help, it didn't actually kill hair metal. So I've only got one more suspect left. And that is, maybe hair metal just got worse. Maybe it just wasn't good anymore. So when I talk about hair metal, I'm talking about the time period 1983 through to 1992, which is quite a long time. So you might think over that time, the quality of music for this type of music might decline, and maybe that's why hair metal died. But actually, and this is a little subjective, but I think it got better. And I know a lot of people who think hair metal from the early 90s is actually some of the best. I mean, some great hair metal albums came out in the 90s. And often you will hear people say, if only it had come out in 1988 or, 1987, it would have been huge. Martin Popoff talks about, these hair metal bands who go to Vancouver and try harder. And it's kind of true. And maybe these bands saw the writing on the wall. Because what they would do is they'd go to Vancouver and they'd hook up with, big producer like Bruce Fairbairn or Bob Rock, get great production, actually put some time and effort into creating what they hope is going to be a great album, a bit more thought behind the lyrics. And some of the bands who did this had some success, at least for a while. So yeah, I don't think hair metal got worse. I think it actually probably got better. Unfortunately, a lot of people never heard it. So, all these suspects, and I still haven't come up with a killer. So, who is it? Who killed or what killed hair metal? Well, I think there's some things we need to consider. When it started dying out, when Smells Like Teen Spirit first hit the airwaves, there was actually no such thing as hair metal. It wasn't called hair metal. It was heavy metal or hard rock. And when grunge and alternative became popular, it didn't just kill the hair metal bands. Life got pretty hard for lots of hard rock and heavy metal bands, not just hair metal ones. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, they lost their singers, at least for a while. They got replacement singers and it just didn't really work. Ozzy Osbourne actually retired. He went on the No More Tours tour. Sure, it didn't last, but it happened. Black Sabbath hooked up with Ice-T and produced one of their least popular albums. Vince Neil left Motley Crue, put out a solo album, and it was a total hair metal album, but no one was interested. Motley Crue got a new singer and probably put out one of their best albums in 1994. But again, very few people heard it. No one was interested. There were, however, some hair metal bands who, in 1992, were still having some success. Ugly Kid Joe and Jackyl both went platinum. Ugly Kid Joe, double platinum. But the thing to remember with both those bands is, they didn't take themselves seriously. Not really. And I think that's what made them a little bit more acceptable. Also, they had no history. They weren't an 80s band. What's also interesting and, perhaps in some ways convenient is to consider the fact that, to some degree, the death of hair metal also coincided with the death of vinyl, which is why my hair metal collection is all on record, and very conveniently, when hair metal died, so did pretty much vinyl. But however, just like vinyl, hair metal isn't actually dead. I mean, just go listen to many of the bands on the Frontiers label. It's like going back to 1989. So actually, I don't think there was a murder. Hair metal isn't dead. It still exists. And it still exists through the 90s and into the 2000s. It did, however, become less popular. So let's talk about what actually did happen when grunge and alternative took over. Well, grunge actually ended up having a shorter life than hair metal did. As I said, hair metal was pretty much 83 to 92. Grunge, well, when it took over from hair metal, it pretty much died when Kurt Cobain died, and he died in 1994. Sure, maybe it lasted a little bit after that, but, sadly, many of the singers of some of the biggest grunge bands are no longer with us. And I got the feeling in the late 90s, hair metal was starting to become not popular, but acceptable again. You had bands like Buckcherry and Beautiful Creatures coming out with albums on major labels. And both those bands had elements of hair metal in their sound. You had the Rock Never Stops tours. They started in the late 90s, and these featured many of the popular, hair metal bands from back in the day. You had websites like Metal Sludge starting up, which, were really popular and featured many of the hair metal bands from back in the day. And even the newer bands were actually now beginning to look a little bit like rock stars. So, there we go. Hair metal's not dead. It's definitely less popular. And what made it less popular is a whole combination of many of the things that I've talked about on this episode today. But let me know in the comments, what do you think killed hair metal? Made it less popular. Because hair metal is not dead. And if Rock and Metal Invasion has anything to do with it, it never will be. All right. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, make sure you hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you later.